If you think I'm fast, just wait until you see my nephew. Coming from anyone who's raced successfully in Formula 1, such sentiment is high praise indeed, and it's even higher when it comes from one of the greatest F1 drivers of all time, in Ayrton Senna. It came from a time when Ayrton and his young nephew Bruno, aged just 5, built a close bond racing karts at the Senna family farm under the watchful eye of Ayrton's father Milton. It would be easy to justify such a quote as Uncle Ayrton merely passing kind anecdotes to young Bruno, in much the same way any parent might stick their child's drawing right up on the fridge. But what if we were to consider it a sincere appraisal? And if so, how do we then explain the stop-start, unfulfilling F1 adventure the next generation of Senna endured? An adventure in which, compared alongside the apparently slower Uncle Ayrton, Ayrton holds 3 world titles, 41 race wins and 65 pole positions, whilst Bruno holds no world titles, 0 race wins, and absolutely bugger all in the pole position column. As always, there's more to the tale than meets the eye, for the story of Bruno Senna contains a plethora of what-ifs and what-could-have-beens that almost beg a belief. So against the advice of those musical madrigals, let's talk about Bruno, and see if we can't figure out just how Bruno Senna failed to live up to that very high standard that Ayrton placed upon him. This tale begins in the worst possible way, at the infamous weekend of the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix. Lap 7. Ayrton Senna's Williams hits the concrete retaining wall on the outside of the Tamburello corner. He hits that wall at 145 miles an hour and is killed. F1, Brazil, and the entire world go into mourning. And understandably, any dreams young Bruno might have had of going racing are quashed immediately. And the Sennas suffer further tragedy just 2 years later, when Bruno's father Flavio, riding the motorcycle he'd inherited from Ayrton, was killed in an accident. With all that personal misfortune suffered so young in life, you can only admire the fact that 10 years after his uncle's passing, Bruno felt the call of the racetrack once more. He quit the business degree he'd been studying at the time, upped sticks and moved to Europe. Financial backing came admittedly somewhat easier to him than most, with the benefit of his uncle's old friend Gerhard Berger able to assist, as the allure of the Senna name returning to the racetrack proved a tasty proposition for a number of sponsors. But whilst the Senna name might have pried open the doors into single-seaters a little easier than other, Bruno still needed to prove himself on the racetrack. Relatives of F1 legends such as Nicolas Prost or Matthias Lauda, neither of whom came close to F1, will testify to that. Whilst he'd secured his return to the racetrack, he'd be doing so with a disadvantage. For a start, he'd be leaping straight past the often trod route of karting and directly into single-seaters, making him one of the more inexperienced heads out on the racetrack, with his fellow racers having a 10-year head start of honing their racecraft on the circuits. And also, bear in mind that Bruno was now 20 years old. That may sound young, indeed my 31-year-old self can only dream of those heady days of excellent metabolism and little to no hangovers, but within motorsport terms it was near ancient. Consider that the same year Bruno was beginning his junior racing career, we had Jaguar's Christian Klein making his F1 debut at 21 years old, and even the oldest rookie that year, Jordan's Giorgio Pantano, was only 25. 14 drivers in F1 history had been 20 or younger on their debut, such as Bruno's fellow Brazilians Rubens Barrichello and Felipe Massa, and rookies were only getting younger and younger. F1 waits for no one, famous surname or not. If Bruno wanted to emulate Ayrton in any way, he'd have to step on it, and quickly. Contesting the final few rounds of the 2004 British Formula BMW series, Bruno scored a solitary 6th place to rank joint 20th overall. Considering it was his first racing venture for a decade and going against those with considerably less race rustiness, it was a pretty solid effort. 2005 prompted a move to British Formula 3, where Ayrton had triumphed way back in 1983. Bruno, though, was still getting up to speed, so rather than gunning for glory, he set about knuckling down, and many would praise him for his work ethic, quick learning and keen ability to listen. He ranked 10th in his first full season of single-seater racing, taking 3 podiums and a single pole position on the way. The rate of improvement got knocked up a notch as Bruno stayed on for a second season. He won his first race at the season opener and then followed that up with another 2 wins straight after. By the year's end, he'd added another 2 wins to that tally to climb to 3rd overall. The year, though, was marred by a massive crash at Snetterton with Salvador Duran, when the two clashed wheels at nearly 150 miles an hour, sending Senna's car into the air, very nearly clipping a bridge. The car was too badly damaged for the second race of the day, losing Bruno some valuable points and a potential runner-up spot. That same year, he also competed in the F3 support races for the Australian Grand Prix. Out of the 4 races held that weekend, Senna won 3, and in the one instance he failed to, recorded a lap time of 1:58.64, which was and remains the fastest ever lap by an F3 car around Albert Park. Confidence was sky high in the Senna camp, and Bruno admitted he was now targeting an F1 drive by 2009, a bold claim considering he'd only been racing cars for 2 and a bit years at this point. He had contacts in the paddock, notably Berger, who owned half of the Toro Rosso team at the time, and speculation swirled on that connection opening a seat there. With those links in mind, it wasn't a surprise to see Senna, having successfully honed his skills in F3, move up the motorsport ladder towards the beckoning finger of the second-tier GP2 series for 2007, with the Red Bull-sponsored Ardent International team. 4th on his debut, he was a race winner in just his 3rd outing at Spain, but the remainder of the season failed to live up to that initial hype, and results thereafter were a decidedly mixed bag. There were 3rd places in France and Italy, but also an 8-race streak after that French podium where he failed to score, with some qualifying woes failing to help him in that time. Still, he eventually ranked 8th, a 3rd straight top 10 finish at his 3rd full year of car racing. Comparatively, he dominated teammate Adrian Zaug, who ranked a lowly 18th, and trumped the man who'd beaten him to the British F3 title the previous year, Mike Conway, who was only 14th. And of the rookies that year, he was 2nd best, just 10 points behind 5th placed Kazuki Nakajima. Expectations were high to continue his rate of improvement as he entered his sophomore year. A switch to last season's champions iSport International suggested that he was seen as one of the title favourites, and with a strong campaign here, Senna's target of reaching F1 by 2009 was very much an achievable one. A strong start to the season saw Senna claim victory on the streets of Monaco, where Uncle Ayrton had won 6 times previously. By the end of that weekend, he led the standings, hotly pursued by Italian veteran Giorgio Pantano, who had been racing in the second tier since 2001, bar a disappointing step up into F1 with Jordan in 2004. With 3 rounds to go, the two remained locked in a tussle at the top of the table, and Senna was just 7 points shy of Pantano, who'd clambered to the top of the standings just after Senna's Monaco win, and hadn't relinquished that lead since. And sadly, that was just about the worst possible time for Senna to go on a dreadful run of form. No points were scored in Valencia or Spain, with a combination of running out of fuel, crashing, and a drive-through penalty for an unsafe release, contributing to that disappointing run. It meant that Pantano had match point upon reaching the final round in Monza, and though a drive-through penalty dropped him out of the points, Senna could only muster 5th that day, and the title went to Pantano. But it would be Senna who took the last laugh. Pantano had beaten him to the title, but his offers for an F1 race seat were as empty as a New Year's resolution, whereas Senna looked prime for a promotion into the big leagues with a tiny little Japanese mark called Honda. Having previously ran their own team in the 60s, Honda had returned for a second bite of the factory team cherry after purchasing former partners BAR in September 2005. In the 3 seasons since, they had run the same 2 drivers, Jenson Button, who'd taken his and the team's first win in Hungary 2006, and the highly experienced Rubens Barrichello, who'd moved to Honda after 6 years at Ferrari. Despite that win in Hungary, 2007 had proved to be a dreadful year, and only 6 points were scored all season, all courtesy of Button, whilst Barrichello had failed to score for the first time in his 15 years in the sport. 2008 had gone only slightly better, with highlights being a surprise Barrichello podium at a very soggy British Grand Prix, a no longer terrible livery, and the hiring of former Ferrari technical director Ross Brawn as a team principal. But they'd slumped further back in the championship, now 9th, and the time was right for change. First on the agenda was moving aside the 36-year-old Rubens in favour of some newer, younger talent. Barrichello had been in F1 since 1993, guided as a protege of Ayrton Senna, and now his mentor's nephew was primed to end that streak. Senna and Honda were a natural fit. Not only had he proven his speed and talent with the rate he'd ascended through the junior categories, but it came with the benefit of being a total marketing dream for Honda. The history of the brands Senna and Honda ran very deep. Ayrton had won all 3 of his world titles with Honda Power, taking 46 pole positions and 32 race wins in that time. Only Jenson Button has raced more Grand Prix with Honda Power, and no one comes close to Senna's success rate. Max Verstappen ranks second in the win column with 15. And if Honda were rubbing their hands in glee at the prospect of signing Senna, then you can only imagine the young Brazilian was positively salivating to climb on board. It was a great opportunity to join an experienced team led by the legendary Ross Brawn, partnering the highly rated Jenson Button in a car that was hotly tipped to be competitive that year after sacrificing their 2008 development mid-season to switch to 2009, when new regulations were expected to shake up the grid order. Schedules were put in place for Senna to test for Honda, first in November 2008 at Barcelona for initial assessment, a chance for him to familiarise himself with the car before the team began to evaluate his performance, technical skill and ability to work within a large team organisation. Senna impressed the team and across the course of the 3-day test came within 0.3 seconds of Button's best time. This was to be followed by another test in Jerez in the early part of 2009 alongside Barrichello, allowing for a direct comparison. You'd forgive Rubens if you saw him putting on his best Ted Striker impression at the time. 2 weeks later, on the 5th of December, it looked like Barrichello was officially out of a job. The problem for Bruno was that so was the rest of the team. Honda had announced that they were exiting F1, citing the global economic crisis. But amongst all that doom and gloom, hopes were still high the team could be saved. Honda and Brawn actively encouraged the workforce to continue to work on the 2009 car, whilst a buyer for the team was sought. Despite all the turmoil, Senna was still favourite to take the second seat of whatever Honda-esque team arrived on the grid. Brazilian press were shouting the Portuguese version of "Extra, extra, read all about it," as they reported Senna had already signed a contract with the team for 2009. Those rumours intensified as, for a while, it looked as if Mexican billionaire Carlos Slim would buy the team, and given that Slim's company Telmex sponsored Senna, it would have been a natural conclusion for the Brazilian to slot in. But the talks with Slim came to naught, as did similar conversations with ProDrive boss David Richards and the Virgin Group. Then, just 3 weeks before the season opener in Australia, the team was saved by a management buyout led by Brawn and chief executive Nick Fry, who bought the team from Honda for a solitary £1 and would enter the 2009 season as Brawn GP. Button, who turned down a drive at Toro Rosso in the pre-season, signed on. Now it came down to Brawn to pick between Senna and Barrichello. If reports were to be believed, Senna had indeed signed a contract for 2009, but with Honda, and given the team was no longer Honda, it was no longer valid. It was back to square one and squeaky bum time as Brawn mulled his options. There was no doubt in his mind how highly he rated Senna, but the question was whether the team was the right place for him. With the team having been saved so late, there'd only be 4 days of pre-season testing, and with no in-season testing, the chance for Senna to learn the car and the circuits was tightly restricted. The team was also running on a budget, typically taking 45 people to a race weekend compared to the average 100 from most teams, and could barely afford to cover a lick of paintwork, let alone the crash damage that often accumulates as a rookie driver learns their limits. In short, it wasn't a conducive environment for Bruno. Brawn, somewhat sensibly, picked Barrichello for the second seat, given his wealth of experience and the good relationship the two had had at Ferrari before. And so Senna could only sit on the sidelines and watch, as the car that could have been his finished 1-2 on its debut in Australia, before sweeping to 6 wins from the opening 7 rounds, and an eventual drivers' and constructors' title double. It must have been as painful as trying to sit through a Brendan Fraser award acceptance speech without crying at any point. At this point, it's worth pondering the first of many what-ifs, and imagining the universe where Bruno gets that Brawn drive, or one in which Honda doesn't pull out and Senna slides into that seat. How would he have fared making his F1 debut in what was comfortably the class of the field in the early rounds? A championship seems too far given the experience of Button opposite, but podiums would have been a near certainty, and if fate would have it, maybe even a win or two. Brawn were not only the class of the field early on in 2009, but their lack of budget would lead to a slow drop-off in development pace and a painful crawl across the line to an eventual World Championship, providing both drivers with the whirlwind tour of both an unbeatable and uncompetitive car all within the space of 1 year. It's hard to say how a young rookie would have handled that, as the Brawn tale is such an anomaly. There's very little comparison points for any other driver in F1 history. But let's say it results in Bruno slumping from podiums to scrapping for points. That still leaves us with a Senna with a drastic difference to his stock in the paddock, and he would have almost certainly been in more competitive machinery in 2010, whether at the Mercedes operation it morphed into or a comfortably midfield team. But alas, that Senna exists behind the door to another multiverse. The one in this world ended up racing Oreca sports cars in the Le Mans series, picking up a couple of podiums. But F1 hadn't forgotten him. When Force India's Giancarlo Fisichella moved to Ferrari to replace the struggling Luca Badoa, whose woes were well documented in a video essay by a handsome and charming content creator, there was a new vacancy on the grid for the upcoming Italian Grand Prix, and team boss Vijay Mallya publicly considered Senna as a replacement option. In the end, though, it was test driver Vitantonio Liuzzi who got the gig. And again, within the space of one season, we get another tantalising what-if. Senna getting that Force India drive would have been a step into an immediately competitive car. Maybe not quite as dominant as the Brawn, but one that had just been on pole and finished second in Belgium, and would go on to take another front row start and top 4 finish in Italy. It would have been an immediate chance to shine, which could in turn have opened doors to staying on at the team for 2010 in a comfortably midfield operation. Instead, Bruno had to fire out his CV elsewhere to find a seat on the 2010 grid, and there were no shortage in seats available. 2010 would see 4 new teams in Virgin, Lotus, Campos and USF1 entering F1, meaning there were suddenly 8 new seats up for grabs. Senna held discussions with all but USF1, and on the 31st of October 2009, he was officially announced as a driver for Campos. It had taken a year longer than expected and would be with a far less competitive car, but finally the Senna name would be back on the grid. Once again though, it looked like money problems might put that F1 dream on hold. Campos was suffering from more budget problems than a me on a trip to a Lego store. Manufacturers Dallara, tasked with building the Campos car, stopped work. No car meant no testing, and the whole of pre-season testing passed without Campos placing 1 millimetre of a tyre upon the track. Speculation swirled as to whether the team would even make the grid. At the 11th hour, majority shareholder Jose Ramon Carabante took control of the team and rebranded it as Hispania Racing. Though the team's future might have been secured, lingering doubts remained over the driver lineup. New team principal Colin Collers admitted the team still needed extra funding and refused to confirm Senna's place at the team, with the Argentine government-backed Jose Maria Lopez sniffing around for a drive. In the end, Senna clung on and was joined at the team by his old GP2 teammate Karun Chandhok. The car was officially launched on the 4th of March, just 10 days before the opening round in Bahrain. It was a less than ideal scenario to make your debut in. The car construction had been more stop-start than a Belgian Grand Prix in the rain, and was eventually scrabbled together within a fortnight. It was Dallara's first official F1 car since 1992, and Hispania's technical director Jeff Willis would accuse them of underestimating just how refined the car needed to be, even for a back-of-the-grid team. That misjudged design was not helped by the aforementioned lack of budget, which meant no car development would come all year, which also resulted in a lack of equipment available. The team too were all new to F1, coming from Collins' racing operations in the DTM, LMP and F3. Willis described them as not quite comical, certainly disorganised, but well-meaning. It was going to be tough for Senna, but in some ways it reduced the pressure on him. Points would be a non-existent prospect, and just arriving to the first Grand Prix would be considered a huge achievement. All he could be expected to do was get his head down, shake off that single-seater rustiness, and try and beat those immediately around him, namely his teammate and the other new teams mired at the back. Qualifying was his strong point, and he outqualified his gaggle of teammates throughout the year 14-5, holding the edge over Chandhok, comprehensively beating Sakon Yamamoto, and showing well against the experienced Christian Klein. In what was easily the slowest car, he was only ever slowest of all on 4 occasions, and managed to haul it off its traditional back row spot 5 times, including a fantastic 20th in changeable conditions at Spa, where he even beat the Sauber of Pedro de la Rosa, albeit after the Spaniard had hit the wall. In races, it was more of an anonymous affair, which owed more to the car than a reflection on his own efforts. Still, he was rarely the last of the finishers by the end of the race, often beating the likes of Jarno Trulli's Lotus or Lucas de Grassi's Virgin. A fantastic start in Japan led to an eventual 15th place finish, just 2 seconds behind Timo Glock, and then good strategy in Korea allowed him to grab 14th, a result which vaulted Hispania ahead of Virgin in the constructors, and Senna above both Virgins in the drivers' standings. Reliability was the biggest issue for the team, and Senna failed to reach the finish 9 times out of 18 races, and barring a couple of crashes in Spain and Singapore, they were always mechanical issues. That and the lack of development on the car meant that any strong starts, like in Australia where he was 14th by lap 3, or chances to battle others like with de Grassi in Turkey, inevitably ended in disappointment by the side of the road. In Monaco, he was well on course for a fantastic 13th place, which would have equalled Lotus's best finish of the year, putting Hispania firmly in the fight to be best of the new teams, before a hydraulic problem cruelly took him out. With such difficult circumstances, frustrations were always going to boil up. Shortly before the British Grand Prix, Senna fired off an email to his sister in which he criticised the team management, in particular team principal Collers, and in one of the biggest whoopsie-doodles in history, Senna inadvertently managed to send said email not to his sister, but to Collers himself, who was unsurprisingly less than impressed, and benched Senna for the next round. In that frustrating atmosphere, it was never going to be a long and happy partnership between the two, and it wasn't hugely surprising when Hispania confirmed in January 2011 that Senna had been dropped from the team. Hispania wanted experienced drivers, since Collers cited that as the only reason they failed to beat rivals Lotus and Virgin, since neither of those teams were running 2 rookies, blindly sidestepping the fact that the car was the slowest of the 3, or that if it wasn't for Senna's 14th place in Korea, they would have finished bottom of the pile. If Bruno wanted his efforts to be actually noticed, he needed to find somewhere more competitive. There were limited options to stay in F1 for 2011, with the only available seats at the time he was officially dropped being at Force India, though it was expected Adrian Sutil and Paul di Resta would shortly be announced there. But again, another what-if scenario for Senna, for if Vijay Mallya had acted on his considerations for Senna in the late 2009, would that provide an opportunity at a team that had become consistent midfield runners? Instead, he settled for a year on the sidelines, signing alongside Roman Grosjean as a test and reserve driver for the Renault team, with team leader Robert Kubica hotly tipped to move to Ferrari in 2012, and sophomore Vitaly Petrov under pressure after an inconsistent debut campaign. A season of hard graft behind the scenes could potentially open a door back into F1. Just ask Esteban Ocon or Alex Albon. But that door to F1 flung open a lot sooner than expected, when just 6 days after Senna had joined Renault, Kubica suffered a heavy crash whilst rallying in Italy, severing his arm and ruling him out of F1 for the remainder of the year and, as it would turn out, another 8 years. Suddenly there was a vacancy at Renault, and Senna, as their reserve driver, was among the first of the candidates on the list. In many ways, it was a carbon copy of the Honda situation all over again. Hopes were high for the team to be competitive, which was backed up by Kubica going fastest in pre-season testing. And as before, Senna found his rival for the seat to be a vastly more experienced hand, in this instance, veteran Nick Heidfeld. The two tested for Renault at Jerez in a direct shootout for the seat. Senna finished a second behind Heidfeld's best time, but what really put the icing on the cake was, once more, lack of experience from the Brazilian. Renault needed a strong driver alongside Petrov. In the midst of all the chaos, it was easy to forget this was an operation that had been race winners just 3 years previously, and world champions 2 years before that. Expectations were high after what Kubica had been wrestling out the car, and in order to match those expectations, Renault needed a solid, dependable pair of hands who could snaffle up points and podiums for the outfit. Heidfeld, with his 172 Grand Prix and 12 podiums, fit that bill more than Senna or Kubica's personal recommendation Liuzzi could ever do. So once more, Senna watched on as a more experienced colleague took the seat that could have been his, and again he could only look as they took advantage of the competitive machinery beneath them, It wasn't quite Brawn levels of dominance, but Petrov and then Heidfeld found themselves taking back-to-back podiums in the opening 2 races of the season, leaving Renault comfortably best of the rest behind the big 3 of Red Bull, Ferrari and McLaren. But a reprieve for Bruno wasn't too far off. At round 11, Hungary, he ran in free practice in place of Heidfeld and finished just 8 tenths from Petrov. And by the next round in Belgium, Heidfeld had been unceremoniously booted from the team, and Senna was in for the remainder of the season. It was perhaps the harshest of harsh browns in terms of firings. Heidfeld had been expected to deliver Kubica-esque performances, a tall order, one doubly so when the team switched all focus onto the 2012 car before the first round of the season, and triply so given the rumours of funding shortages that would limit any car development. Yet despite that, Heidfeld had still managed to wrangle the car into 6-point scoring finishes from those 11 races, and was ahead of Petrov in the drivers' table. So it was hardly the golden opportunity the same seat would have presented at the beginning of the year, and now here was Senna, expected to go even better than Heidfeld had in an increasingly uncompetitive car after half a season away. Not that you would have known on his first outing. Bruno took what would be a career-best 7th in qualifying, Renault's best since Spain. But a clumsy clattering manoeuvre on the equally high-flying Jaime Alguersuari left Bruno with a broken front wing, a drive-through penalty, and a disappointing 13th place. Italy provided a second top 10 start, but another chaotic first corner, this time courtesy of Liuzzi doing his best impression of a bowling ball, meant some hasty avoiding action was required and Senna dropped to 15th. Steadily he worked his way through the field to wind up 9th, just behind De Resta. It was his best race in F1 yet, and many argued it was a real demonstration that Senna was truly worthy of his race seat. Yet from there on it was sadly all downhill for Bruno. Though he would qualify twice more in the top 10 in those final 6 races, marking a 50% success rate in that category, no more points came Senna's way, though Petrov would only add 3 to the Renault tally in the same time. It wasn't through a lack of trying, but a barrage of silly mistakes put paid to any hopes of adding to his own points tally that year. A 9th place start in Japan became an eventual 16th place finish, after being squeezed out by Petrov at the second corner and being unable to carve his way through the resulting traffic, not helped by severe tyre degradation that day. Another 9th place start in Brazil became 9th in the race, but a silly clash with Michael Schumacher provided him with a main course of front wing damage, a side of drive-through penalty, a tall glass of gearbox problems, and a final bill of 17th place. On both occasions Petrov carved through the grid to finish in the points. A poor qualifying put paid to any points in Korea, where Petrov had started 8th, whilst a drive-through for ignoring blue flags in Abu Dhabi left no chance of result there either. It wasn't always his fault. He ran 9th in India until 4 laps from the end, when a late stop and KERS issue dropped him to 12th. And in Singapore, so bad was the tyre degradation that Senna could barely steer the car, and even bumped into the wall at one point as he and Petrov finished 2 laps down that day. At the season's end, Renault scraped into 5th place in the Constructors, nearly 100 points behind Mercedes, and just squeaking ahead of Force India. Questions were now being asked over who might drive the Renaults next year, and whether Petrov and or Senna were worthy candidates to do so. The door to a full-time promotion creaked open when Kubica was forced to rule himself out of a return that year, but then the door got slammed closed with a surprising announcement that former champion Kimi Räikkönen, exiled from F1 for the past 2 years, would be joining the team. Petrov was set to retain his seat, only to launch an extraordinary tirade against the team on Russian TV, effing, jeffing and delivering a withering critique on their lack of development and strategic errors. Renault weren't terribly pleased with such behaviour, and with Petrov now unable to drive owing to the large bullet he'd shot through his own foot, the door back into F1 for Senna had promptly swung back open again. And on the 9th of December, Renault's test driver was promoted into a race seat, not Senna, but Romain Grosjean instead. And for the first time, Senna no longer had the excuse of being looked over due to a lack of experience. Grosjean only had 7 races to his name way back in 2009. Instead, he was left to rue what could have been from that opportunity at Renault. Granted, an increasingly undeveloped car and stratospheric expectations hadn't been much of an opportunity, but in F1 you make the best of what you can, and Bruno had arguably failed to have done so. There had been some bright sparks and he'd proved a solid match for Petrov, but there were too many mistakes. In a way, despite some top 10 qualifying performances and scoring points, Senna's bit part campaign with Renault had maybe done more harm than good to his reputation, as expectations were much higher compared to his time at Hispania, and any errors were much more visible and less acceptable. That damaged reputation cost him any hope of laying claim to that seat for 2012. For the umpteenth time, Senna watched a seat he could have taken rocket up the pecking order that year. Renault became Lotus and established themselves as one of the better teams on the grid, scoring 10 podiums and a win courtesy of Raikkonen in Abu Dhabi. The soon-to-be-decreed first-lap nutcase of Grosjean scored 3 of those podiums amidst a plethora of incidents that would result in a one-race ban that year. How would the more experienced head of Senna have fared? Would he have learned his lessons from the previous year and delivered a more rounded performance? Or would he have been liable to the same errors that Grosjean produced? Instead, Senna was on the move once again, and just over a month later, he was confirmed as a Williams driver, partnering Venezuelan Pastor Maldonado, and ironically replacing Barrichello, who had denied Senna his debut with Brawn all those years ago. Though Frank Williams declared himself impressed with Bruno's speed, technical insight and consistent learning, people question whether there weren't better options on the market, such as the similarly quick, more proven Adrian Sutil. Perhaps the combination of the bad press around the Germans' assault charges of the time, weighed against the appeal of the Senna name and the 14 million euros in sponsorship, helped the Brazilian enormously. Certainly many others felt that way, and they were quick to label Senna's signing as nothing more than a publicity stunt, one driven by the fallen legends of Williams snaffling up some sponsorship scraps. There was no denying that the gravitas of the name Senna returning to Williams nearly 20 years after Ayrton had been there had some appeal, which was echoed by Bruno upon his confirmation to the drive. Quite a few of the people here actually worked with Ayrton, and hopefully we can bring back some memories and create some great new ones too, he said. Positive Senna might have been, but joining Williams in 2012 was a less than ideal situation. For a start, this was his third team in as many years, and hardly a competitive one to be jumping into either. Williams might have been former champions, but the last of those had been in 1997, and their last race win had been in 2004. The previous year had been one of the worst seasons for Williams in their long history, scraping together a measly 5 points, and slumping to 9th in the Constructors, the lowest they'd ranked since 1978. And just to really bump up the difficulty of this new challenge to Dark Souls levels of hard, Senna's contract included a stipulation that on 15 of the 20 race weekends, he would be giving up his car during free practice for the team's new test driver, a well-regarded new Finnish talent by the name of Valtteri Bottas. So not only was Bruno missing out on some precious time in the car to get up to speed, but it was widely assumed within the team that, bar the crossing of some T's and dotting of a few I's, that Bottas would be taking Senna's seat for 2013. Already the pressure was on for Senna with a severe handicap to impress enough to either prize the well-moneyed Maldonado out of his drive, or catch the eye of another operation and continue to scrabble onto his foothold on the F1 grid, while simultaneously continuing his one-man mission to drive for a different team every year. Yet despite all those obstacles to overcome, there was a small glimpse of light at the end of the tunnel. Williams were looking a more competitive operation than before. At the season opener in Australia from 8th on the grid, Maldonado had run solidly in the points all race long and was in 6th with just a lap to go. That was until Crash Tour did, well, exactly that. Bruno never got a chance to find out if he could have been in the points too, when a great start was mitigated by being tagged in the first corner, and then compatriot Massa took him out later on. The pace was there, it just needed some consistency to go alongside. And in describing Senna's 2012, consistent would be a solid adjective to go by. The next time out in Malaysia, Bruno arguably enjoyed one of his best days in F1. Forced into an early stop after clashing with Maldonado, he was 23rd when the race was red flagged. But Bruno and the team used that time to bolt on a mast and hoist the sails on his car, and Bruno mastered the treacherous conditions to take a fantastic 6th place. That was the first of 10 point-scoring finishes that year, more than the likes of Michael Schumacher, Sergio Perez or Maldonado would manage. The race after in China, Bruno worked his way up from 14th to an eventual 7th, ahead of Pastor, and just 8.5 seconds shy of Hamilton in 3rd place. With another big points haul, he vaulted into the top 10 in the drivers' table for the first time. Another standout drive came in Hungary, as he channeled the future spirit of Alex Albon by widening his Williams as far as he dared, holding off Massa and the Nicos of Hulkenberg and Rosberg for another 7th place. And despite being a blameless party in a first lap tangle in Abu Dhabi, he recovered strongly to collect some solid points there in 8th. With those results plus 6 other points finishes, Bruno had a 50% success rate of bringing home the bacon. Indeed, bar a slow puncture in Belgium, which lost him 8th place but did secure him the fastest lap after bolting on a new set of tyres, an engine failure in Singapore where he'd clambered to 9th from 22nd, no small feat on the tight and twisty street circuit, and a rather overly aggressive Michael Schumacher whilst running 8th in Spain. That success rate could have been even higher. So with those statistics in mind, it might come as a surprise that actually, Bruno's 2012 campaign was a disappointing one. And to understand why, we need to crane our necks across the Williams garage and check out just what Pastor Maldonado had been up to that year. Comparing the two side by side, the duo could not have had more of a contrasting year. Senna, the quietly consistent one, picking up the points more often than not, and Maldonado, the wildly inconsistent one, scoring points on just 5 occasions that year in a year loaded with more incidents than the cheesiest and greasiest of loaded fries. But that was the key to dividing the two. For all his inconsistencies, Pastor was undeniably eye-catching, and that for all of Bruno's consistencies, he was the anonymous one. We briefly touched on it at the beginning, but Pastor had a habit that year of dragging the Williams into some very lofty positions, only to inevitably find a way to throw those big points hauls away on every occasion. Moments like a podium in Valencia, gone after clashing with a rapidly slowing Hamilton. 4th in Britain, gone after clashing with Perez. Top 5 qualifying pace in Monaco, mitigated after a silly clash in practice. And there were other opportunities lost too, ones outside the Venezuelans' control. Being taken out early on in Belgium, though admittedly after jumping the start by about 30 years. A front row start in Singapore, only for a hydraulic failure to deny him a podium that day. And another podium in Abu Dhabi, denied after a KERS failure following the first safety car. But when it went right, it went right. And nowhere was it more right than in Spain, where, while Senna started 17th and was eventually taken out by Schumacher, Maldonado started on pole after Hamilton was excluded from qualifying, and went on to take a famous victory, Williams' first for 7.5 years, and to date, their last in F1. Meanwhile, Senna, aside from his results in Malaysia, China, Hungary and Abu Dhabi, was only scoring points at the tail end of the top 10, with a 9th place and 5 10th place finishes. The highest he ran all year was 4th, and even then, for a whole 2 laps, over 1,000 completed that year. Though Senna's final season's tally was just 14 points shy of Maldonado's, that was more a case of Maldonado's mistakes dropping him down the table than Bruno being on the Venezuelans' pace. Indeed, if we adjust their points tallies by factoring in potential points lost from both drivers, then the tally reads Senna 41 and Maldonado 120. Yes, Bruno was receiving less time in the car, and arguably the missing of free practices would have hurt. A lack of practice would have led to a lack of pace. Senna suggested at least a couple of tenths, and that in turn would explain his poor qualifying results, something that had previously been a strong suit for him, and an absolute demolition at the hands of Maldonado, who outqualified Bruno in 18 of the 20 races that year. Indeed, if we apply the point system onto qualifying results that year, Maldonado would have scored 113 points, and Senna would have scored 3. By the British Grand Prix, it was generally accepted by Senna and his team that he'd qualify poorly, so they planned for longer first stints in an attempt to vault him up the order. It was hardly an inspiring vote of faith for the Brazilian. Putting aside the comparisons between quiet consistency and loud inconsistency, it wasn't a good year for either driver. Christian Horner noted that Williams' eventual 8th place finish was an inaccurate showing, and that if you had 2 top liners in there, that car would have won more races and been a bigger factor. To me, it looks like a top 3 car. And in one of the biggest surprises in F1 and world history, then Williams executive director Toto Wolff agreed with that analysis. Neither Senna nor Maldonado had delivered on that promise, but at least Pastor had a pole, a win, and several other eye-catching, replay-worthy moments to add to his CV. Nothing Senna did could really compare to that. You can be as consistent as you like, but if your teammate is the one with the headline-grabbing performances, even just the once, that can have a huge impact on your standing. Take Daniel Ricciardo and Lando Norris in 2021, for instance. Norris was the one hoovering up the points all year long, but when push came to shove, Ricciardo took the win at Italy, and it's that which is shown on replays and highlights of the year, not another points finish by Norris. 3 days after the 2012 season had ended, the unsurprising news came that Bottas would be taking Senna's seat for 2013, and so back on the sidelines went the Brazilian. Thankfully, that was one of the more positive what-ifs for Bruno, as had he stayed on with Williams, he would have found a car that would drop down the pecking order once more. There was a vacant spot at Force India, but according to Bruno, at one point the team simply ceased negotiations without so much as a thanks for your time. Discussions with Caterham also failed to produce a seat, and so the F1 grid was Senna-less once more. A month after his F1 tenure had ended, Bruno signed for Aston Martin in the World Endurance Championship, and he was a winner first time out in the GT class. 2 seasons in the Formula E Championship provided some reliably midfield performances, but he found himself out of a drive after his second season, and in classic Bruno fashion, his team Mahindra subsequently vaulted up the order the very next year. Back in endurance racing, he found more success, becoming the first man to win a race in every wet class, and winning the LMP2 World Championship in 2017 alongside Nicolas Prost. 8 entries at Le Mans resulted in a best ever of 2nd in 2020, in what would be his last racing event. On the ground at least. Nowadays, he works as a development pilot and global ambassador for Airspeeder, the world's first racing series for manned flying electric cars. The tale of Bruno Senna reads like an animated Marvel series, episode after episode of tantalising what-ifs. Of course, that's no different than the tales of so many others scattered throughout F1 history. What if Lewis Hamilton had come into the pits just 1 lap earlier? What if Nigel Mansell's tyre hadn't blown out? What if Nikita Mazepin knew how to drive a car around a corner? What sets Bruno apart is the sheer volume of instances where he found himself so desperately close to drives and opportunities that would have undoubtedly steered his career into entirely new directions. Seats at Brawn and Renault passed him by, both citing a lack of experience, and whilst the reasoning behind their rejection of Senna may have made sense, desiring a steady pair of hands rather than a rash rookie, are we not in the age-old debate of denying someone a role through a lack of experience, but then refusing to provide them the opportunity to garner experience? When he did get his foot into the F1-shaped door, it's suffice to say that the opportunities he was presented with were hardly the best. An underfunded bunch of newcomers who had barely scraped onto the racetrack to begin with, ex-champions still reeling from their superstar's horror crash, who then expected equivalent performances in a car that received less and less development, and an operation arguably with one if not both eyes on the driver lineup for the next year, content to treat Bruno as nothing more than a stopgap and deprive him valuable time in the car. Time in a car that, in some suitably prepared hands, could have dazzled the world. But this is F1. It's increasingly rare that one can just rock up to the paddock and step into the best car on the grid. You need to earn your way to the top, and you do that by taking difficult situations and still finding and making opportunities to shine. Many have done so, see Fernando Alonso in his Minardi or Ayrton Senna and his Tolman. And Bruno, whether in his Hispania, Renault or Williams, failed to do that. We could also debate what if Bruno was given more time, wasn't shunted around from place to place, and instead found a team committed to a longer-term plan for the Brazilian. How much growth and improvement could we have seen from a Senna in a nurturing and supportive environment? Sadly, we never got that, because anytime Bruno received the faintest whiff of stability, he seemed to blow his shot through either errors or total obscurity. And whilst I may have bemoaned Brawn or Renault passing him by due to a lack of experience, one could also argue that such inexperience could have been overlooked if Senna had truly been providing testing performances that no one could turn down. But based on the instance of his unsuccessful shootout against Heidfeld, he wasn't doing that. Is it the case then that Senna just wasn't that good? That Ayrton's famous line of how fast Bruno was nothing but familial praise? Yes and no. Was the Bruno Senna we saw faster than Ayrton? Absolutely not. That's a debate with an even shorter duration than anyone's hoped we wouldn't witness another Max Verstappen stampede in 2023. But is the Bruno Senna we could have seen faster than Ayrton? That's the interesting point. Perhaps the biggest what-if in the tale of Bruno Senna doesn't concern Bruno. What if Ayrton had survived his crash on that fateful day? It's quoted in the documentary Senna that Ayrton died because his car crashed at the exact angle for the suspension shaft to hit his helmet, and that if that piece of assembly would have gone 6 inches higher or lower, he would have walked back to the paddock. If Senna survives that crash, then the whole of the F1 history timeline completely shifts. And not just the Senna-Schumacher battle we never really got to see, but we get a Bruno Senna who isn't denied a decade's worth of racing experience, and who, even better, has the guiding hand of Uncle Ayrton to take him through his racing career. With a more complete racing education behind him, we could have seen someone so much better than who we got. That Bruno made it to F1 with such a disadvantage is incredible, and one earned through his own merits rather than just being a Senna. Just imagine how well he could have done in this other reality. It wouldn't be unreasonable to see a scenario where Bruno vaults into F1 a lot sooner, say 2005 or 2006, an initial stepping stone with the likes of Jordan or Minardi, or maybe even filling in the 2006 Williams seat that originally went to another famous F1 surname, Nico Rosberg. Is it beyond the realms of fantasy to witness a similar career to Rosberg, a journey from the midfield to race wins to the World Championship? What if, once more? No one sums up Bruno Senna better than the man himself. During that 2012 season, 13 drivers stood on the podium that year, and arguably, Bruno could have nabbed one too. He was running ahead of eventual third-place finisher Michael Schumacher at Valencia when Kamui Kobayashi crashed into him, leaving Senna to limp back to the pits to eventually recover to 10th. There are a lot of could-have-beens, but motor racing is full of those, said Senna. Only when it actually happens do people start to pay attention to you. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider pulling into the pit box of my channel, bolting on the tyres of hitting that subscribe button, and tearing off the fresh visor of hitting the like button. I've had word from the pit wall that it's the best strategy available for you.